I'd like to acknowledge Sir Lawrence van der Post's daughter Lucia, but she's in Botswana, so she's represented by her husband Neil Crichton Miller. Thanks, Tim, my wonderful friend on this long and very difficult journey that's led to this day, for your kind words. Now, my gratitude to Sir Bob Geldof for agreeing to talk at the launch of Freedom is completely bottomless. Because in my view, Sir Bob, your concern for humanity is second to none, and your preparedness to relentlessly point out the horror of our species' plight makes you the conscience of the world. I love your honesty so much that to me it's like the coming of the summer rains that water the parched. No, it's very important. He's. I was thinking this morning he's like John the Baptist crying in the wilderness, whatever the phrase is. No, he keeps telling the world, you know, he's like that canary in the mine that tells us that things are desperately out of whack. And that's important. He's a great inspiration, his honesty. And I know he's champion of lots of other things, but that to me is so special. So I'd like to begin by mentioning some of the amazingly honest statements made by Sir Bob. And he says, here we go, but it's very important because it emphasises that we have to solve the human condition, that's the unlocking point for all of the problems we face. So I'll just read a couple of them. At a conference in Montreal a week or so ago, where is the public good in the vast inequality wrought by modern capitalism, which Sir Bob's just referred to again. And then he said, I never felt greater fear and greater anger than I do today. He made a similar comment to that. And he's already deep in the heart of nowhere album, he's saying, what are we going to do because it can't go on? This is the world calling. God help us. And searching through their sacred books for the holy grail of why, but the total sum of knowledge knows no more than you or I.
Forget literature, just buy that album and all the wisdom of the ancients will come to the fore.
There's a lot of truth. If you read Freedom, there's a lot of quotes from songs, and because the truth bubbles up in rhyme, and so it's amazingly prophetic statements. And in the brilliant Yeats documentary last month, you pleaded for Yeats' revolution of the mind, where peace, pluralism and respect will replace hate and aggression. And at the very end of your book, Geldof in Africa, you said, feed the world, for we are empty of hope and too full of despair and have nothing to nourish our dreams. Basically, you're pleading for the food we really need, which is understanding of the human condition. Now, the real frontier, the ultimate frontier that we have to explore is not outer space but inner space. As Sir Lawrence van der Post said, we have to, in what you saw on the screen, we have to go sharply in reverse, join our old natural selves with our willful conscious self. Again, the message is we have to solve the human condition, understand ourselves. And as I'll seek to make it clear, unless the reconciling understanding of the human condition was found, as I'm suggesting it now is, in Freedom, the rapidly escalating pain and alienation in humans is going to increase at such a rate and at such an extent that all the suffering humans have experienced to date will be minuscule compared to the amount of human suffering that would occur. And I want to say that there's only one doorway out of that plight, and that is this doorway that I'm going to talk about, which is through this understanding that ameliorates our troubled selves. In Van der Post's terms, heals the split between night and day, between our original natural self and our conscious self. It's been 50 years journey to get to this day and to this venue and this presentation. Now, to begin, so Bob, you're a fabulous humanitarian, but as you said just then, that and you said it to me the other day, The holy grail of why, as you referred to in your song, the human condition exists is a question that biologists, empiricists, I think you just referred to, like myself, have to answer. Biology is a study of behaviour, and we're interested to make sense of our behaviour, get to know ourselves. You know, in the temples, the ancients had man know thyself. Unless we find understanding ourselves, we're in big trouble. That's the unlocking thing. And that's what I'm going to talk about today. I'm going to make sense of us, like you've never heard it made sense of before. And it'll grow and grow on you, this understanding, because it's true and it's what we need. So it takes time to digest it, but it's incredibly powerful once I can convey the idea, communicate the basic idea. Now, I want to begin by statements Bob made, which is, he said, we're not going to turn into people who are all hugging each other, Jeremy, because we're all competitive by nature. The question is, how do we relieve ourselves from our unchangeable primal instincts that are selfish and competitive? That's a principle in biology that all humans have been subscribing to that I now want to tear to shreds. And I want to say that after exposing the lie, that fundamental lie that we're all using to justify our divisive behaviour, I'll then explain that ours is a psychological condition and a psychosis can be healed with understanding. So Bob, in that moment of deep thinking, said we can't fix ourselves because we're fundamentally, genetically selfish and competitive. And so what are you going to do about that, Jeremy? But I'm going to tackle that head on. We aren't. It's a psychosis. Now, this is very, very interesting stuff I'm going to be showing you. It'll absolutely knock your socks off, some of this stuff I'm going to... Okay, it's certainly true that we have used the excuse that we humans are competitive, aggressive and selfish because we compete for food, shelter, territory and mate like other animals do in order to reproduce our genes. But of course this can't be the real reason for our competitive and aggressive behaviour, because firstly, we humans have cooperative, loving, moral instincts. The voice or expression within us we recognise as our conscience. And Charles Darwin acknowledged this when he said, the moral sense affords the best and highest distinction between man and the lower animals. And to have an instinctive, altruistic, moral nature as we humans do, our distant ancestors must have been cooperative and loving, not competitive, aggressive like other animals. And secondly, descriptions of human behaviour such as egocentric and arrogant, inspired, depressed, deluded, pessimistic, optimistic, artificial, hateful, mean, immoral, guilt-ridden, evil, psychotic, neurotic, alienated, all recognise the involvement of our species' unique, fully conscious thinking mind, that there is a psychological dimension to our behaviour. Humans have suffered not from the genetic opportunism-based, non-psychological animal condition, where they're always trying to reproduce their genes, but the conscious mind-based, psychologically troubled human condition. We don't talk about the animal condition, we talk about the human condition. So saying we have competitive and aggressive instincts like other animals is not true. It's just an excuse, but again, an extremely necessary one, as I want to now explain. It's been a very, very necessary excuse that got us out of a horrific situation, which I want to now describe. Now, to start, let's imagine that it is true that our distant ancestors lived cooperatively, lovingly, and the instinctive memory of which is our moral sense. So in following that idea through, let's imagine that Plato was right when, long ago in 360 BC, he wrote, this is 360 years before Christ, he said, our state of innocence, before we had any experiences of evil to come, when we were simple, calm and happy, pure ourselves and not yet enshrined in that living tomb which we carry about now, a time when we lived a blessed and spontaneous life, when neither was there any violence, war or quarrel among us, and we dwelt naked and mostly in the open air, and had no beds but lay on soft couches of grass. This is Plato, 360. I mean, and let's imagine that Plato's compatriot Hesiod was right when in his poem Theogony he wrote, "When gods alike and mortals rose to birth, a golden race the immortals formed on earth. Like gods they live with calm untroubled mind, free from the toils and anguish of our kind. Strangers to ill their lives in feasts flowed by. They with abundant goods midst quiet lands, all willing shared the gathering of their hands." And let's imagine that our mythologies were right when, as author Richard Heinberg summarised, every religion begins with a recognition that human consciousness has been separated from a divine source, that a former sense of oneness has been lost, that everywhere in religion and myth there is an acknowledgement that we have departed from an original innocence, and that the cause of the fall is described variously as disobedience, as eating of the forbidden fruit in Christianity, the fruit from the tree of knowledge, becoming conscious. That's what they're saying. So we became conscious, and the shit hit the fan. Everything seemed to go to hell. And further, let's imagine that it is true that primatological studies of bonobos, which is the variety of chimpanzee living south of the Congo River, are revealing a great deal about how loving, cooperative our distant primate ancestors likely were. Now these are a couple of quotes here that'll you'll be absolutely astonished. To evidence this, these are some absolutely amazing descriptions of bonobos. Bonobos are surely the most fascinating animal on the planet. They're the closest animal to man. They're the only animals capable of creating the same gaze as a human. And then this guy goes on, and once I got hit on the head with a branch that had a bonobo on it. I sat down, and the bonobo noticed I was in a difficult situation and came and took me by the hand and moved my hair back like they do. So they live on compassion, and that's really interesting to experience. Yes, a bonobo, listen to this, as bonobo keeper Barbara Bell said, adult bonobos demonstrate tremendous compassion for each other. For example, Kitty, the eldest female, is completely blind and hard of hearing. Sometimes she gets lost and confused. They'll just pick her up and take her to where she needs to go. And Bell said they're extremely intelligent. They understand a couple of hundred words. Working with them is like being with 2.5-year-olds. They love to tease. Like during training, if I were to ask for their left foot, they'll give me their right foot and laugh and laugh and laugh. Researchers have said that bonobos historically have existed in a stable environment rich in sources of food, and unlike chimpanzees have developed a more cohesive social structure. For example, up to 100 bonobos at a time from several groups spend their night together. That would not be possible with chimpanzees because there'd be brutal fighting between the rival groups. So here's a photo of a bunch of bonobos. Now notice that what's being said is amazingly similar, well it's absolutely identical, to what Plato described long before bonobos were even known of, which was that our distant ancestors dwelt naked and mostly in the open air, and they had no beds and lay on soft couches of grass. There's the soft couches of grass. And in Hesiod's words, they with abundant goods midst quiet lands, all willing shared the gathering of their hands. Bonobos' unlimited capacity for love is apparent in this wonderful first-hand account from a researcher, Vanessa Woods. This is someone who works in the Congo Basin studying bonobos. Bonobo love is like a laser beam. They stop, they stare at you as though they have been waiting their whole lives for you to walk into their jungle. And then they love you with such helpless abandon that you love them back. You have to love them back. And significantly, bonobo society is matriarchal and focused on nurturing their infants, as this quote evidences. Bonobo life is centred around the offspring. Unlike what happens among chimpanzees, all members of the bonobo social group help with infant care and share food with infants. If you're a bonobo infant, you can do no wrong. Bonobo females and their infants form the core of the group. Now, I don't have time to go into it here, but the significance of nurturing and how it created our moral instincts, and also bonobos' cooperative, loving society, is explained in chapter 5 of Freedom. So that's an insight into how amazingly cooperative and loving bonobos are. Now, if all these imaginings are right, that our distant ape ancestors lived completely cooperatively and lovingly, and then we became fully conscious and for some reason began to behave competitively, aggressively and selfish, then how absolutely terrible a predicament would that condemnation have been? This is incredibly important. If we did live metaphorically in this Garden of Eden state of cooperative, loving innocence, and then we became conscious, and for some reason which we didn't understand, we became incredibly, instead of loving and gentle, we became, developed a propensity for shocking deeds of violence, depravity, indifference and cruelty. For some reason, we had turned into seemingly evil monsters, sufferers of the human condition. So we can now see that it makes complete sense that the guilt from trying to think about and confront the truth of the horror of our corrupted condition has been so great that we could only cope with it by not coping with it, by adopting all manner of dishonest denial and excuses, basically blocking out any thoughts about how corrupted we'd become. Plato's famous cave allegory, in which he depicts humans having to hide deep underground in a cave because they couldn't face the truth of the imperfections of human life, is an accurate description of how deeply resigned to living in denial of this issue of the human condition we humans have been. So I just want to go over that again. If we lived a lovely, harmonious, cooperative existence, and then we became conscious, and then we became competitively aggressive and selfish, and we had no understanding explanation for why, how terrible would that have been? How great would the guilt have been? Let's imagine that you lived in a small village and for some reason you weren't able to explain, and the whole village agreed that no one was to plant weeds, but you had to plant your whole place out with thistles. Imagine after, and you can't explain that. Imagine after just 1 week, you go down, no one will talk to you. They put dead cats in your letterbox, and the ostracism because you can't explain it. You've had to do this seemingly terrible thing, and you can't explain it. How ostracised would you feel in that village after 1 week? Well, try imagining 2 million years of living without the ability to defend yourself, to explain yourself. That's how long we've been fully conscious. And as I suggested, the human condition has existed. You can't imagine a worse torture to have been so loving and cooperative as we've seen suggested what the bonobos are doing, and then have had to become competitive, aggressive and selfish. We would have felt terrible. I might just put this picture of, so that's Plato's cave. So this is a drawing I've done of the human journey from ignorance to enlightenment. And you can see on the left there, we lived in this childhood innocent state in this Garden of Eden in Africa. And then we started to become conscious, and then we became competitive, aggressive and selfish. So we're suddenly faced with having to live a life of incredibly anger, egocentricity and alienation. And you can see sitting on the ridge there, looking back, you're looking at this magic time and looking forward into this wasteland. And you're still looking at that. Because children, when they're about 12 or 13 or 14, they actually still wrestle with the human condition. They actually can see that. They can see their soul's still alive. They can still see that something's terribly wrong. And they try to understand that. And adults can't explain it. So they go into themselves and just lock themselves in a room and bang, listen to loud music because they can't make sense of the horror. But one day, when they're about mid-15, it's so depressing what they're trying to face down, they give up. Most of us can remember resigning. You get glandular fever and parents can't relate to their kids. That's because they're still trying to face the issue of the human condition. And then, see, because when we were adults, everyone went through that stage, they learned to block it out. but they haven't yet learned to block it out yet. They're still trying to face the issue of the human condition down, and it's so it's so depressing, so suicidally depressing, that they've finally realised that they've got to join the masses and do what everyone else is doing and just forget that dark corner forevermore. It's too depressing an issue to talk about our lost innocence. So so that's a very important position to understand what we would have done if we believed that we'd turned into monsters and we couldn't explain why. We would have to come up with some excuse. We couldn't just accept that we were monsters. So we desperately needed to come up with some way of justifying ourselves. So what excuse was there that we could think of? Well, we looked around, and other animals are always fighting and competing and tearing each other's throats out. And so to save ourselves from suicidal depression, we said, well, that's why we're competitive and aggressive. We too have savage animal instincts that compel us to compete for food, shelter, territory, and a mate. Further, we said that the task of our unique conscious mind is to try to control those supposed brutal, savage instincts within us. So it was a very clever idea, but completely untrue, because we have cooperative, loving past, not a brutal, competitive, selfish one, as I've just described. Yeah, it was an absolutely brilliant excuse, because instead of our instincts being all loving and thus unbearably condemning of our present non-loving state, they were made out to be vicious and brutal. And instead of our conscious mind being the villain, which caused us to lose the plot, caused our corruption, it was made out to be the blameless mediating hero that had to manage this supposed vicious instincts within us. So instead of our instincts being good, which is in the terms of being cooperative and loving, and our conscious mind being bad, having caused this departure from having killed off this paradoxical state that we'd lived in, our instincts were made out to be bad and our intellect good, which, while enormously relieving, was a complete reverse of the truth lie. Our instincts were loving, and our conscious mind was not the hero, it was the villain that had caused this corruption. So it's a very, very seductive idea. And that's what Sir Bob was using when he said, Jeremy, we have innate instincts that we can't change, which are to be competitive and aggressive. Now, just to describe what's happened, if you go to university, what's happened to that idea, which is a huge lie. I mean, it's as I said, it's a complete reverse of the truth lie. So when Darwin came along with his idea of natural selection, this excuse that we have brutish and savage animal instincts was given a biological base by misrepresenting natural selection as being a survival of the fittest process. Natural selection is the process by which some members of a population reproduce more than others in a given environment, and in the first edition of The Origin of Species, Darwin rightfully left it undecided as to whether those individuals that reproduce more could be viewed as winners, as being fitter. However, in later editions, Darwin's associates Herbert Spencer and Alfred Wallace persuaded him to substitute the term natural selection with the term survival of the fittest, which is the excuse most people today use to justify their competitive and selfish and aggressive behaviour. I'm just making sure I'm a winner. So it's a distortion of the basic idea that there is this difference in some species, some individuals reproduce and some don't. But whether that means you're fitter to reproduce is not necessarily true. Now, the problem that merged with this so-called social Darwinism is that it didn't explain instances of selfless cooperation in nature, such as occurs in ant colonies, and it also didn't explain our altruistic moral nature. Now, to solve that problem, the theory of evolutionary psychology or sociobiology was invented, which said that ants are indirectly, selfishly fostering their own genes by fostering their relatives. In the case of ants, that explanation holds true, but when it was used to explain our moral nature, it was found to be wanting, as the journalist Brian Appleyard pointed out. Biologists still have a gaping hole in an attempt to explain human altruism. If, for instance, I help a blind person across the street, it is plainly unlikely that I'm being prompted to do this because he is a close relative and bears my genes. Now, so we've got to run with it. You've got to keep it in mind. We had this magic time. We had to find some excuse. This one will do. So we latched onto it and wrapped our arms about it. It was saving us from suicidal depression. Someone had to come up and try and fix up that hole in the idea. To solve this problem, the multi-level selection theory was invented, which claimed we have some selfish instincts selected at the individual level and some selfless instincts selected at the group level. Now, even though this group selection idea has been fully discredited on the grounds that any selflessness that develops is always going to be exploited by cheaters, human condition avoiding biologists, which are basically all biologists, have nevertheless adopted it through acceptance of the multi-level selection theory. So this idea that we are intrinsically, our ancestors were competitive and aggressive, has got a huge head of steam. It's a huge industry built around it. And there's one big problem which Sir Bob referred to, which is that we are selfish because we have selfish instincts excuse, is that it implies that we are intrinsically imperfectible. It implies we can't change our selfish and competitive primal nature because it's instinctive in us. It's in our genes. So you see Bob's comment, Jeremy, we can't change our fundamental nature. How much he's absorbed all this culture built on this lie that we have selfish heritage, competitive heritage. The whole of biology is now based on this fundamental lie that we are competitive and aggressive like other animals. Libraries are full of this dishonest nonsense. Afraid of being holistic and confronting the human condition, science has instead been mechanistic and reductionist. As my professor at Sydney University, Charles Birch, said, what we've been all taught at university is pretty much a dead end. Because they're all using this lie. Now, you've got to remember, we had to embrace this lie because it was the only thing that's saving us from suicidal depression. So when adolescents are 14 or so, and you can't relate to them if you're a parent, they're immersed in this horror of trying to make sense. They're trying to face the human condition, and you can't do it without an understanding of it. And they don't buy this bullshit that we have credit, because their soul, their instinctive self, is telling them the world is completely kaput, it's wrong. Everyone should be behaving lovingly. So what has gone wrong? They have rediscovered, or they have discovered, what's it called? Ontogeny recapitulates phylogeny. So each generation has to catch up to where the whole of their species, the human race, is at in its journey. And the human race hasn't found the real explanation, which I'm now going to give you, of why we were competitive and aggressive. So the human race, the children have to catch up. They go through the whole journey that the human race has been on, where they try to understand why we became corrupted, why our magic soul was corrupted. And if you try to face that down without the understanding, you're going to end up suicidally depressed. Everybody has had to adopt this lie, and it's become a huge industry. The whole of university campuses, all the libraries, probably 90% of these books that talk about biology is going to be based on this lie that we are fundamentally aggressive. And it's stark staring obvious that it's not true, because we've all got a moral conscience. Where do we get that from? It didn't come out of thin air. We had it a lovely as Plato and magic time in this of innocence that we lived in, that the bonobos are still living in, at the present living in. As I now explained, it's fully understandable that we had to invent and then believe in an excuse to cope with our extremely corrupted condition. But it means biology is now festering in a cesspit of human condition avoiding dishonest biological crap, living deep underground in Plato's metaphorical cave of darkness. So Bob was only articulating what everyone has been believing in.